30 feet down, at the bottom of a river in northern Florida, the water is the color of strong tea. Tannins leaching from cypress and oak leaves stain it so dark that a diver's flashlight barely reaches past an outstretched hand. It is cold, it is blind, and it is the last place most people would expect to find the answer to one of the oldest questions in American history. When did the first people arrive on this continent, and how long have they truly been here? But that is exactly what divers found at the bottom of the Aucilla River, about 45 minutes southeast of Tallahassee, at a submerged sinkhole called the Page-Ladson Site. And what they pulled out of the black water did not just add a footnote to the story of the first Americans, it rewrote the timeline entirely. The evidence is 14,550 years old. Stone tools and the butchered remains of a mastodon, an elephant-like beast that has been extinct for thousands of years, resting together in undisturbed sediment at the bottom of the river. A stone knife, sharpened on both edges by human hands. A mastodon tusk carved with the unmistakable grooves of a tool, the marks left behind when someone cut it free from the skull to get at the nutrient-rich tissue inside. People were here, on this spot, hunting and butchering a mastodon beside a watering hole, more than 14,000 years ago. To understand why that number matters so much, you have to understand the story that Page-Ladson demolished. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists believed they knew who the first Americans were. They were called the Clovis people, named for a distinctive style of fluted stone spearpoint first identified in Clovis, New Mexico, and the accepted wisdom held that they arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, crossing from Asia and spreading across the continent as the Ice Age ended. Clovis first. That was the rule, defended for decades, and evidence that suggested anyone was here earlier was treated with deep suspicion or dismissed outright. Page-Ladson was one of the sites that got dismissed. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, researchers working at the Aucilla River sinkhole had already found stone tools and a mastodon tusk with cut marks in sediment more than 14,000 years old. They had, in effect, found the answer decades ago. But their work was buried underwater, both literally and figuratively. An age of more than 14,000 years was, in the words of one archaeologist, an impossible age for the scientific community to accept at the time. Because the site was submerged and underwater excavation was mistrusted, and the date broke the Clovis first rule, the findings were set aside and all but forgotten. Then, in 2012, a team led by Jesse Halligan of Florida State University and Michael Waters of Texas A&M University went back down into the tea-colored water to settle it for good. What they did down there was genuinely remarkable, because underwater archaeology of this kind had almost never been attempted in the United States outside of shipwreck recovery. The team treated the 30-foot-deep sinkhole exactly as they would a dig on dry land, but blind, in near total darkness, in cold black water. They used underwater lasers to control the precise depth of their excavation. They ran vacuum tubes to gently suction away sediment before it could cloud what little visibility they had. Divers surfaced, clutching mastodon bones and the fragile remains of a lost world, piece by piece, out of a river that would not let them see their own hands. And sealed within the undisturbed geological layers, they found it all again. Stone tools, tool-making flakes, a bifacial stone knife, and the mastodon remains, including that tusk with its butchering marks. Then they radiocarbon dated everything around it, carefully, repeatedly, and the numbers came back the same as they had decades before. 14,550 years old. This time, published in the journal Science Advances. The evidence was called unequivocal. People had lived and hunted at this spot in Florida, a full 1,000 years or more, before the Clovis culture existed. The old rule was broken. The first Americans had arrived earlier than the textbook said. There is a detail here that borders on the unbelievable, and it captures how intimate this evidence really is. Among the most important artifacts recovered was a fragment of a stone knife, knapped by a human hand, found inside the fossilized stomach contents of the mastodon itself. The remains of the animals' last meals, preserved for 14,000 years in the oxygen-poor sediment, held within them a piece of the very tool used to butcher it. The hunter and the hunted, sealed together in the mud at the bottom of a river, waiting all that time for someone to swim down into the dark and bring them back up. The landscape that made this possible no longer exists, and understanding it is the key to everything. 14,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the world was a different place. Enormous quantities of the planet's water were locked up in glaciers, which meant sea levels were as much as 300 feet lower than they are today, and the water table across Florida was far lower too. The rivers were not flowing the way they flow now. Florida was drier, larger, its coastline pushed far out into what is now the Gulf of Mexico. The Osceola River sinkhole was not underwater at all. It was a spring-fed pond, a reliable source of fresh water in a dry landscape, and that made it a magnet, drawing thirsty animals and the people who hunted them. Mastodons came to drink. Humans came to hunt the mastodons. And a watering hole became, without anyone intending it, a near-perfect trap for preserving the record of their encounter. Then the Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, the seas and the water tables rose, and the pond slowly drowned beneath the river that runs over it today. The rising water that hid the site was also the thing that saved it. Sealed under sediment and water, cut off from oxygen and disturbance, the tools and the bones and the stomach contents lay perfectly preserved for 14 millennia, safe from the decay and the churning that destroys almost every trace of such ancient life on dry land. And that points to the largest implication of Page Ladson, the one that reaches far beyond a single sinkhole. If the earliest chapter of human life in the American Southeast was preserved because it was drowned, then much of that chapter is still down there, underwater, unfound. When the first people were living along that ancient lower coastline, they were living on land that is now submerged beneath the Gulf of Mexico, in rivers and sinkholes and springs. The dry land archaeological record of the very first Americans is thin precisely because so much of the world they lived in went under when the Ice Age ended. The places they camped, the shores they walked, the water sources they depended on, a great deal of it lies beneath the water now. Page Ladson is not an isolated marvel. It is a single window into an entire drowned prehistory that has barely begun to be explored. The work continues across Florida's rivers, where recreational divers and archaeologists keep finding fossils and stone tools together, keep pulling pieces of the deep past out of the tea-dark water. Each one chips further away at the old certainties about who was here first and when they came. And each one reinforces the lesson of Page Ladson, that the earliest Americans left much of their record not on land, where we have always looked, but underwater, where almost no one thought to look until a few divers descended into a blind river and came back up holding the proof. For decades, the answer sat 30 feet down in the dark, dismissed because it was submerged and because it broke the rules. It took divers willing to excavate what they could not see to bring it into the light. And what they found beneath Florida did not just belong to Florida. It belonged to the whole story of how human beings first came to this continent. A story that turns out to be older and deeper and far more hidden underwater than anyone was willing to believe.